After 3 months of investigation, Mireille Thibault admitted that she was at a loss to explain the manifestations. Traces of mold and mildew had been found here and there, but it was highly unlikely that they were causing hallucinations. As for the possibility that it was a ghost, no one had as yet determined its identity. Whenever there's a haunting, as was the case for Louis and Marie-Claude, researchers check into the past to see if anyone has died a traumatic death at the site, like the victim of a murder, for instance. The danger with this approach is accepting that the dead person and the ghost are one and the same, with no other confirmation. Parapsychologists are putting less and less faith in these post-mortem ties.
In most cases, apparitions are associated with a location, houses, public buildings, cemeteries, and even land. In the United States, the field that was the scene of the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War in 1863, is now reputed to be haunted. Whether it be a site, like in Gettysburg, or a house, as was the case for Louis and Marie-Claude Côté, the apparitions seem to be related in some way to the spot where they appear. In the case of crisis apparitions, the person seen is directly linked to the person who sees the apparition.
Eva Roy's parents divorced in 1952. The young girl was placed in one foster home after another. As the years went by, she had the feeling that she was unwanted. Finally, she was entrusted to the care of her grandparents who lived in Victoria. As she spent time with her elders, Eva began to find joy in living once again. Her grandfather was particularly attentive towards her.
The only joy she can recall in her childhood was when she was allowed to stay with her grandparents. He was a nice man, smoked a pipe, sit back, listen to all, a child's troubles. The only problem was that he was getting sick and old, and he couldn't look after her. So she had to be moved on to another foster home, and then her parents took her in.
In 1964, Eva, who is now 14, went back to live with her father, who had remarried. The newly formed family lived in a small town in British Columbia, far from the coast, far from Victoria.
She really missed her grandfather, and she did hear that he was not doing very well, but it did come as a sudden shock when she found out that he had died. And on the night of his death, he came and told her that, yes, he had gone, but he'd always be there for her.
And her grandfather kept his promise. Whenever she found herself faced with a dilemma, Eva felt as if she was being guided in her choices by the voice of her beloved grandfather. In 1985, Andrea Lancaster was living with her family in Maple Ridge. The Lancasters went through a difficult period when they learned that an aunt in England was dying. Every time that the phone rang, they would fear that it was someone calling to say that the aunt had died. One night, something odd happened after Andrea went to bed.
And one day, Andrea woke up to see Aunt Doris in the family crypt, in the family grave, half in and half out. She said she looked up, and Aunt Doris looked up and said, "I'm so sick. I want to go so badly, but I'm afraid of leaving you and your father."
The apparition didn't last long. It became hazy and disappeared. 3 days later, the Lancasters heard the news. Aunt Doris had died, right around the same time that Andrea saw the strange projection from the astral world.
Comment font foi ces histoires?
As these stories show, ghosts can appear in many different ways depending on the location and the person who sees them. That's probably what makes it so difficult to come up with a single universal theory to explain them. In the world of strange phenomena, nothing is ever simple. When an investigation is carried out into a haunting or a ghostly apparition, all avenues must be explored. In this type of investigation, the possibility that something supernatural occurred must be put aside until all other possibilities have been exhausted.
The first thing to do is to adopt an attitude of systematic doubt, question the accuracy of witness accounts without succumbing to the skeptical pitfall of completely rejecting everything. You have to know how to separate objective elements from subjective perceptions. In other words, determine what can be verified using tools like video cameras, digital cameras, and what is simply an impression felt by the witness, like a feeling of being observed or discomfort in certain spots. Once the elements have been sorted, incidents should be studied on an individual basis, keeping in mind that 100% objectivity does not exist. In the case of crisis apparitions, it is practically impossible to eliminate the theory of extrasensory perception in favor of the survivalist or spirit theory. In the case of young Eva Roy, who saw her grandfather at the foot of her bed at the exact moment he was dying several kilometers away, it is possible, if we accept the reality of extrasensory perception, that the teen saw her elder remotely by means of some sort of parapsychological mechanism. In the case of crisis apparitions, the spirit of the deceased person has nothing whatsoever to do with the apparitions. It is simply a case of extrasensory perception. In the case of hauntings, where there is a supernatural manifestation at a specific location, the extrasensory perception theory could also apply. This is supported by a theory that certain very strong emotions can be recorded by or permeate the walls of a house.
Personally, I like that theory. In the case I investigated, the hauntings had been going on for 50 years. We determined the history of the house and noted the phenomena that were occurring. According to the traditional theory, it was a ghost trying to pass on a message, but the events were very random. There was no pattern to them. When we had the equipment set up, nothing would happen. And when we weren't ready, we'd hear rapping noises in the wall, so I figured there was no message behind them. Then I noticed that the occurrences were like things that might have happened at an earlier time period. For example, there was the sound of a door latch and footsteps passing me by. Whoever it was didn't stop to give me a message, they just kept on walking. We recognized some people from the past. One of the witnesses described a person with a curved back, wearing a hat, and in the past, there had been a resident that corresponded to that description. But there was no message for us. The person didn't die dramatically, so it didn't fit with the stereotype of a haunting. It was as if we were seeing and hearing events of the past with no intention behind them. So I find it an interesting theory, but only for the cases that last a long time. I'm not talking about cases that last for only a month or so, but houses that have been haunted for 50 years or more. I find it fascinating to think that we can see into the past like that.